Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it in front of everyone, and the room didn't even flinch. That's what stunned me the most. Her voice was steady, polished, the kind she used in those corporate update meetings she always wanted me to watch. It's not about you. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She was fixing a sleeve of her new Gap blazer, smoothing it down like I was nothing more than a wrinkle in her schedule. And when I answered, "Exactly. That's why I'm done," her smile fell so hard it felt like the only real sound in that whole fluorescent-lit conference room. I wasn't supposed to be there. I dropped by her office with lunch. Chick-fil-A, her favorite, though she only ever picked at it while replying to messages I never saw. I wasn't spying. I wasn't suspicious. I was just a woodshop teacher on a half-day, trying to surprise his wife. But then I heard her laughing with her department's curator, the same guy who believed in her potential, the same guy whose name she never fully said, only hinted at, like he was some atmospheric pressure only she could feel. I stood in the doorway long enough to hear everything. She told him she wasn't worried about the project because he'd make sure it landed where it needed to. She told him I didn't really understand her world, that I was supportive but simple, as if being rooted in something real was a flaw. The curator said something I couldn't make out, but I caught the tone, casual ownership. Not of her, but of her pathway upward. And she let him have it. When she noticed me, she blinked like I'd interrupted a rehearsal. That's when she gave me that line. It wasn't about me. It was about access, leverage, rooms she wanted to enter, and he was the keycard. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stay long enough for her to craft some polished apology. I just set the Chick-fil-A bag on her desk, nodded once, and walked out. I got into my Toyota Camry, closed the door quietly, and sat there long enough to feel the silence settle over me like a decision already made. I drove away without checking the rearview mirror. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. I didn't plan on pulling away from her life. It just happened the moment the door of my car closed and the world finally went quiet. I drove without a destination, letting the engine hum long enough for my heartbeat to match it. By the time I stopped, the sun was dropping behind the school where I taught, turning the windows of my workshop into mirrors. I looked at my own reflection and realized I didn't recognize the man who still tried to understand her choices. I stayed there until the parking lot emptied, until the silence felt cleaner than anything waiting at home. When I finally walked through our front door that evening, she was already there, typing something on her laptop with a focus I used to admire. She barely looked up, only asked if I'd picked up the bulk groceries she'd ordered from Costco. I didn't answer. I just set my keys down and went straight to the shower, letting the water cool along my back until everything inside me matched its temperature. She never asked why I was so quiet. She didn't notice the shift, or she noticed and believed she had bigger things to think about. For the next few days, I adjusted my routine without announcing anything. I left earlier for work, stayed later, and kept my phone on silent. I ate alone, sometimes grabbing something quick and warm from Taco Bell, sitting in the parking lot long after the food was gone. The quiet there felt more like home than the house we shared. I didn't avoid her, but I didn't orbit her anymore. She'd become someone living in a different altitude, breathing a different kind of air, and I wasn't going to chase her into places where integrity had to be negotiated. She tried small talk once or twice, asking about my students, about lesson plans, about whether I could fix the loose cabinet hinge. I answered with the fewest words possible, steady and polite. She didn't understand this version of me, the one who wasn't waiting for her attention or approval. It unsettled her, though she tried not to show it. The distance wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate, and for the first time, she felt it, not as a punishment, but as something she couldn't control. The shift really began the night I found her laptop open on the kitchen counter. I wasn't looking for anything. I came home late, the house dark except for the glow of her screen, left on like she'd rushed out mid-thought. I walked past it at first, heading to the fridge, telling myself none of it mattered anymore. But something in the air felt off, tense in a way I couldn't explain. When I turned back, the screen was still awake, showing a calendar filled with color-coded meetings I'd never heard about. One name appeared over and over, attached to every strategy session and private review. Her curator. I didn't scroll. I didn't dig. The evidence was already loud enough. But as I closed the laptop, A notification popped up. It was a message preview from him, a small line of text she probably thought wouldn't mean anything if anyone else saw it. He wrote that he'd booked a quiet corner booth near their office, that the restaurant was close enough to Chick-fil-A for her to slip away without raising eyebrows. I stood there, staring at that flickering bubble of words, and the truth finally settled into place. This wasn't an affair of affection. It was an arrangement, a transaction for status, and she had stepped into it fully. I didn't touch the laptop again. I didn't confront her. When she came home an hour later wearing that same structured Gap jacket she always chose for important days, she didn't notice anything different about me. She moved around the kitchen like she was still in her office, pacing, muttering deadlines under her breath. I listened for a moment, then picked up a box of our old things from the hallway closet and carried it to the garage. No explanation. No questions. I set it on a shelf and stood there until the cold air steadied me. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I opened my phone and posted a few unused household items on Facebook Marketplace. Nothing sentimental, just things taking up space. The act wasn't about letting go. It was about making room. And for the first time, she wasn't part of what I was planning. I didn't disappear. I just stopped moving in her direction. That was the first thing she felt, even if she couldn't name it yet. A week after I found the message from her curator, the house settled into a strange pattern where she kept trying to resume normal life, and I kept refusing to step back into the role she'd assigned me. I wasn't distant out of anger. I was distant because I finally understood she had chosen a world where I wasn't needed, and I wasn't going to fight for a place she'd already given away. One evening, she came home juggling a Costco bag and her laptop, speaking into the air like I was still waiting to be updated on her schedule. She mentioned a late meeting, mentioned deliverables, mentioned that her curator said the team couldn't move forward without her input. His name slipped out casually, like he'd become part of her daily rhythm. She didn't notice the way I froze for half a second, or the way I didn't ask what the meeting was about. I didn't need her explanations anymore. She followed me into the living room, asking why I hadn't answered her texts. I told her I'd been busy after school, helping one of my seniors finish a project. My tone was steady, almost quiet, and it disarmed her. She wasn't used to me being unavailable. She wasn't used to me not reacting. Her confusion hung between us, and for the first time, I saw her really look at me, not with irritation, not with impatience, but with something like unease. That night, while she graded her corporate slides and prepared for another curated presentation, I sat in the garage with the door half open, sorting through another box of things we didn't need. I posted a few more items on Facebook Marketplace, watching the messages come in from people looking for cheap furniture. The space around me slowly cleared. It felt like my life was shifting inches at a time, away from her orbit. She stepped into the garage at one point, hesitated, then asked if everything was okay. I told her yes. Nothing more. She stood there longer than she meant to, unsettled by the truth settling between us. I wasn't leaving, but she was losing me all the same. The real fracture showed itself on a Thursday night, subtle enough that she probably thought it was nothing. She came home late, still carrying the tension of whatever meeting she'd been pulled into, the kind where her curator spoke in low tones, and she nodded like every word was a stepping stone. She dropped her bag on the counter, loosened the collar of her Gap blouse, and asked if I wanted to order in. The question sounded practiced, like something she remembered couples were supposed to do. I told her I'd already eaten and didn't mention that I'd grabbed something from Taco Bell on the way home, sitting alone in the parking lot until my mind felt steady again. She hovered near me, waiting for conversation that didn't come. I kept working on a small wooden project for my students, sanding edges until the grain felt clean under my fingers. The quiet between us wasn't angry. It was directional. She was trying to pull me back into a rhythm I no longer lived in. And the more I stayed calm, the more her composure thinned around the edges. Later that night, she stepped out to take a call. She tried to hide the name on the screen, but I caught enough of her expression to know exactly who it was. Her voice softened in a way it never did for me anymore. Not warm, but deferential, tuned to hierarchy. When she returned, she acted like nothing happened, slipping back into the kitchen and pretending to organize the groceries she'd picked up earlier from Costco. She said the team needed her early the next morning, that her curator wanted her input before the board review. I simply nodded and kept my eyes on my work. She waited for a reaction, a question, a hint of resentment, anything that would prove I still cared about the space she was disappearing into. But I didn't give her that. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Before bed, I sold another old piece of furniture on Facebook Marketplace. When the buyer drove off, I stood in the empty space it left behind, feeling something shift inside me again. Not loss. Not grief. Just room. Room she hadn't earned back and room I wasn't offering. Her unraveling didn't start with tears or accusations. It started with the way other people began looking at her. The shift was small at first, like a light flickering before it burns out. I noticed it the day her company hosted a community event at the school where I taught. She showed up with her team, polished, composed, wrapped in another one of her Gap jackets like armor. Her curator stood beside her, close enough to signal something, far enough to deny it. They moved through the crowd in that corporate rhythm they shared. Tight smiles, clipped phrases, eyes scanning for leverage instead of connection. I stayed near my students, helping them display their projects and talking with parents. Her colleagues recognized me. Some had met me before. This time their smiles felt different, strained, curious. One of the senior managers pulled her aside, shot a quick glance at me, and whispered something I couldn't hear. But I caught the tone, half question, half warning. She stiffened, answering too quickly, her voice flat. Her curator's expression tightened, as if he'd suddenly realized the optics weren't as controlled as he thought. It wasn't a public accusation. No one pointed fingers. It was worse. It was the quiet acknowledgement that people had started to notice a pattern she thought she'd hidden. A few co-workers exchanged looks when she and the curator stood too close. Parents asked me how I was doing with a softness that didn't match the context. The social shift spread through the room like a cold draft, subtle but unmistakable. She approached me once during the event, offering a quick comment about how impressive the students' work looked. The words were fine, but her eyes were restless, searching my face for anger that wasn't there. My calm unsettled her more than any confrontation could have. When I answered politely and returned to my students, she froze in place, unsure whether to follow or retreat. On the drive home, she barely spoke, gripping the steering wheel like she was holding onto the last thread of a story slipping out of her hands. I rode in silence, watching the streetlights blur past, feeling the distance between us widen without a single raised voice. That silence wasn't punishment. It was truth. Her isolation didn't announce itself. It crept in, quiet and methodical, the same way she once climbed her corporate ladder. The first sign came on a Sunday morning when she walked into the kitchen, still wearing the same Gap jacket she'd worn to the event, like she hadn't slept well enough to change. She asked if I wanted to drive with her to Costco, something we used to do together when weekends still felt like shared territory. I told her I had work to finish in the garage. No explanation. No apology. Just a calm boundary she couldn't step over. She stood there longer than necessary, waiting for me to offer something. Maybe a chance to fix the distance. Maybe a hint that I still belonged to the life she'd tried to protect from scrutiny. But I didn't give her anything. I simply returned to my project, letting the sound of sandpaper answer for me. She left the house without another word, the silence stretching behind her like a hallway with no doors. Hours later, when she came back, her arms were full of bulk groceries, and there was a stiffness to her movements. She wasn't angry. She was unsettled, like she'd walked through public spaces and felt something she couldn't name. Maybe a coworker avoiding eye contact. Maybe a comment that landed too close to the truth. Maybe just the realization that her curated world wasn't as airtight as she believed. That night, she tried again. She stepped into the garage, offered me dinner, mentioned that Chick-fil-A would still be open for another hour. I thanked her, but said I'd already eaten. She didn't need to know I'd sat in the car earlier, watching the parking lot lights settle into the windshield while I finished a simple meal in total quiet. It wasn't about avoiding her. It was about recreating a space where my thoughts weren't competing with her ambitions. She lingered beside me, her voice softer than it had been in months. She asked if something was wrong, but she avoided using the word we. Even then, she still framed everything as a personal inconvenience, not a consequence. I told her everything was fine, steady, even, and it was. I wasn't pulling away to punish her. I was pulling away because the version of us she'd built no longer made room for someone like me. The worst part for her wasn't that I'd changed. It was that she had no influence over the change at all. The confrontation didn't come as a fight. It came as a quiet moment she didn't know how to survive. It was late, close to midnight, when she walked into the living room and saw me packing another small box with things that had belonged to both of us once. Old picture frames, mismatched decor, the kind of items that filled a house without ever making it a home. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't hiding. I was simply clearing space again, listing a few pieces on Facebook Marketplace before bed. She stood there in the doorway like someone realizing a room had shrunk around them. She asked where the box was going. I told her it didn't need to be here anymore. The calmness in my voice startled her. She stepped closer, lowering herself onto the edge of the couch, as if getting physically closer might pull me back into her gravity. She said she felt like I was slipping away, that things didn't feel right between us. She didn't mention her curator. She didn't mention the messages or the lunches near Chick-fil-A that she didn't think I knew about. She just circled the truth, refusing to touch it. I listened, not interrupting. Her words had a tremble she tried to steady. When she finally asked what was happening, I told her I'd been paying attention. Not to her excuses, but to her choices. I said it gently, without accusation, and watched her expression shift from confusion to fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control of the narrative she'd been building for months. She searched my face for anger. She found none. That was what broke her composure. She said she didn't want us to fall apart. I told her that wasn't what was happening. What was happening was distance. Distance she created, and distance I no longer tried to close. She moved closer, reaching for my arm like touch could rewrite everything. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. I stayed still, present but unreachable. She asked if we could talk, really talk, but her voice carried the same tone she used in corporate meetings, a tone trained to negotiate outcomes. I told her quietly that I wasn't negotiating anymore. The room fell into a silence she couldn't fill, a silence she finally understood wasn't temporary. Her collapse didn't happen all at once. It came in pieces, slipping through the cracks she'd pretended weren't there. The first piece fell the morning she learned her curator wasn't as untouchable as she thought. I overheard her on the phone in the hallway, her voice sharp, strained, too controlled to be steady. Something about a review being postponed, something about upper management asking questions they weren't asking before. She ended the call abruptly and walked into the kitchen like she needed the walls to hold her up. She didn't see me watching from the doorway, noticing how the confidence she wore like a tailored jacket suddenly didn't fit. She left for work early, barely touching the coffee she made. When she walked out the door, she looked smaller than I'd seen her in months. I stayed home a bit longer, grading assignments before heading to school, and the silence of the house felt like the first honest breath the place had taken in a long time. That afternoon, one of her coworkers stopped by the school to drop off materials for a joint program. She hesitated before mentioning that things at my wife's office had become complicated, that people were starting to distance themselves, that the partnership between her and her curator wasn't looking great from the outside. She didn't say more, but she didn't need to. The words were enough. Someone once protected had become someone to avoid. When I got home that evening, she was already there, hours earlier than usual, sitting on the couch in her Gap work clothes like she'd come apart the second she stepped through the door. She looked at me with eyes that had finally stopped pretending. She said she felt like everything was slipping, like people were treating her differently, like doors she thought she'd earned were suddenly closing. She asked if I knew why. I didn't answer. I just set my keys down, grabbed a small box from the garage, and continued clearing the house one item at a time. Later, I posted another listing on Facebook Marketplace, and when I came back inside, she was still in the same position, quiet, frozen, staring at a world she no longer recognized. Her collapse wasn't loud. It was the sound of someone realizing they'd climbed a ladder leaning against the wrong wall. The final break didn't come as an argument. It came as a moment so quiet it felt like the world stopped moving. I found her sitting at the kitchen table long after sunset, still in her Gap work clothes, staring at nothing. The house was dim, the kind of dim where you can hear your own breathing. When I walked in, she straightened a little, as if she'd been rehearsing something she couldn't quite say. She told me her curator had stepped back from her projects, that upper management was restructuring, which was just a polished way of saying he wasn't useful to them anymore. She said some coworkers had stopped replying to her messages, that a few meetings had been reassigned without explanation. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She just sat there, speaking in a voice stripped of corporate polish, like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. I listened, leaning against the doorway, keeping my posture calm and steady. She told me she felt like she'd lost her footing, like everything she built was suddenly fragile. Then she finally said the words she'd avoided for months. She said she missed the way things used to be between us. She said she couldn't understand how I'd become so distant, so quiet, so unreachable. I told her nothing had happened suddenly. I told her I'd simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. The truth hit her slowly, landing piece by piece, until her eyes finally lifted to meet mine with something real for the first time in a long time. She whispered that she didn't want to lose me. I believed she meant it. But meaning it and earning it were different things now. I sat across from her, letting the silence stretch. Not to punish her, to make sure she understood the weight of it. She reached out, but her hand hovered, unsure if she still had the right to close the distance. I didn't pull away, but I didn't move closer either. I told her quietly that if we were going to start again, it would be on different terms, ones built in the open, not behind closed doors or curated meetings near Chick-fil-A. She nodded, a small, fragile motion, like someone learning how to breathe again. When I stood, she stood too, waiting for some final judgment. Instead, I told her I wasn't leaving. Not because she asked, because I chose to. I walked past her, grabbed my keys from the counter, and told her we would rebuild slowly, and only if respect came first. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt like it had room for truth. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.